Good afternoon. It's great to see so many of you decided to stay with us late into the second day of this excellent conference. I'd like to invite you to participate with us today in the role of regional cooperation to enhance opportunities for offshore wind in the Pacific region. Please do stay close. As soon as we're complete with today's panel, we have the Deputy Secretary of Interior, Tommy Boudreau, will be giving the final keynote, so do stay close for that. My name is Jason Busch. I'm the Executive Director of the Pacific Ocean Energy Trust and a founding board member of Offshore Wind California. And today I'm very pleased to moderate this panel. I'd like to introduce our panelists now, starting with Commissioner Ryan Calkins from the Port of Seattle. We have Molly Kroll, who's Pacific Offshore Wind Director for American Clean Power Association, and Greg Murphy, Senior Manager, Strategic Partnerships, and Tesla Communications Group. So for this panel today, we're going to briefly describe what's happening north of the California border, and we're going to turn our attention to the question of regional collaboration. This is definitely not the first panel I've sat on where the topic of regional collaboration has been discussed. In fact, it's been discussed now for a few years. If you've been here for the last 2 days, I think you most certainly have heard a number of references to the many opportunities and challenges of offshore wind and the need for regional collaboration to make the most of these opportunities and to address the challenges. I think while it's always understood that eventually there would need to be some collaboration to make the most of these opportunities to date, really there has been very little formal engagement across state lines. I'm aware of the Department of Defense's funded transmission work going through Schatz Energy Lab, and has brought the Oregon Department of Energy to the table. I'm aware of POET's own initiatives, the Forward and POTS initiative, looking at utility markets and transmission, but those are both voluntary educational forums. So I think that we understand that as we stand here on the precipice of extensive offshore wind development, we're going to need to collaborate along the West Coast to solve the onshore challenges of transmission, infrastructure, energy markets, among others. All three states are active in offshore wind. Clearly, California is leading in a very big way. But Oregon is doing its best to get to leases in 2024, and Washington is treading water right now, I think, as the energy markets continue to evolve around offshore wind. But it is promising, and I think we'll hear more about that today. So it's our hypothesis for this panel that floating offshore wind development shares regional markets and regional challenges like transmission and port infrastructure. There have been recent studies around transmission and ports that have pointed to this need for regional solutions to regional challenges. And the question is it time for collaboration across the Pacific region, which could provide efficiencies and optimize planning and investments? So I want to start by just presenting an open-ended question to the panelists today. And simply put, do you agree with the idea that we need regional solutions? Is collaboration a goal? If so, why or why not? And Molly, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Jason. I'm very happy to be here. So it's a question for me where the first immediate answer is, well, yes. And then the second answer is, well, what are we talking about, really? And the yes is kind of founded in like an abundance vision of the Pacific coast of the U.S. is the dominant floating offshore wind leader globally. And we have like 50 gigawatts of offshore wind that's well sited, benefiting local communities, responsibly managed, and each state has a big piece of that. But then I get to the point of, well, do all three states on the coast actually share that vision right now? I think California is there, but Oregon not quite, and Washington probably even a little bit farther behind. And this leads then to the question for me, what stimulates progress on offshore wind, which we all know we need? And competition, as well as collaboration, stimulates progress. Competition has been really a big part of progress on the East Coast, where there's been competition for who can set the highest offshore wind target, who can procure first the best projects in development, and other things like local incentives for supply chain and manufacturing to encourage home state development. So competition is a motivator, but obviously competition without collaboration will lead to, as you said, inefficiencies, gaps, redundancies, which we don't want. California also being in the lead, and California is my home state. I do not want California to wait for other states to get to where California is. But with that situation, I think there's still so many areas for potential collaboration. And if you kind of think of it in a tiered way, starting with sort of lowest level, but really important, best practice sharing, information sharing, that's like a no-brainer. We should be doing that. California is doing a lot of things for the first time that Oregon and Washington will benefit from. And then moving up towards shared planning, would love to see that, especially if we can coalesce states around a shared vision of large-scale offshore wind. And then harder to do is like mutual commitments, shared investments, things like that, which we could get there, and hopefully sort of working on those first steps provide sort of a platform and habit of collaboration and get us to that place.
Thank you. Commissioner Calkins, thoughts?
Yeah, I think what I would add to Molly's comments is that I think there's a lot of collaboration already happening, that in ways that maybe we don't think about because it has to do with the ecosystem on which offshore wind on the Pacific coast is going to be built. As a port commissioner, I look and see all of the ways in which the West Coast ports already collaborate, and we're going to be able to build on top of that in terms of our role in the offshore wind industry, whether it's using container trade as an example. When we standardized that form of doing business, it meant that we could all benefit from efficiencies of scale that came from both the standardization of the equipment associated with it, but also the ability for the steamers to use these strings of ships to serve my port, Tacoma, Oakland, all the way down the coast, everybody getting a little bit of the business, and in that way being much more efficient as a system than single ships running back and forth across the ocean from one port to another. And I think that same kind of mentality is what we ought to be using here. I think the other area where we can see that kind of efficiency is we have a shared workforce, whether it's the unions that tie us all together or the brain trust behind what we do, the various contractors that every port relies on for port design or for engineering services, stormwater services, you name it. Those same sets of skills are going to be needed for the expansion of ports along the West Coast. So that collaboration is happening. And I would also say that, at the initial level, I'm proud to say that there's a lot of work already happening in Washington to support the California supply chain. And I welcome when we join California in a few years with our own plans for offshore wind, I welcome the inputs of California ports and supply chain to help us meet our targets as well. I think it just makes sense for us to have a system-wide approach to it. So, and one final thought, and that is that I think if we manage to pull off strong collaboration on a coast-wide level here, we actually have an opportunity to achieve a much bigger prize, which is a larger Pacific Rim ecosystem developing and floating offshore wind that includes Korea and Japan and China and elsewhere. That if Washington tries to do it alone, even if California tries to do it alone, we're not going to have the kind of efficiencies or economies of scale to be able to participate in bilateral trade with some of those nations that have even bigger goals than we do in a lot of instances. So I think we benefit from that if we collaborate too.
Thank you. Greg, your thoughts?
And Jason, I'll go. Thanks for having me. Really great to be here. It's a real honor. Congratulations to everybody in the room for getting the industry to where it is today, especially offshore wind California. Partnerships is in my title as a career, so I would say yes, and just to keep it short, it depends on what specifically we're talking about. So I think we'll get into more of that as we go along. But I would say also a lot of this is already informally happening, and we've heard a lot about that the last couple of days here in Sacramento and other conversations. I think now is the time, we heard this from industry, now is the time to start formalizing some of these processes, formalizing some of these dialogues. And I think that's part of the implementation phase that we're all really excited to get into now.
Thank you. Commissioner, talk to us a little bit about Washington. What's happening there? What's the state's posture in offshore wind?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not revealing anything new in stating that we are certainly taking our time in getting to a place where California has been. And I think that has in part to do with, we rested on our laurels for a little bit. We have such an abundant source of renewable energy and hydro that I think we didn't get off the starting blocks very quickly. However, I think we're beginning to see some real progress in terms of doing the grounding work that we need to do to understand whether and how to do responsible offshore wind development in Washington State. There's a couple of things that may not get much attention, but the state does have a state energy strategy, and it includes at 2045 3 gigawatts of offshore wind. So it has already been put on paper in one of the state's energy strategies that was produced by the State Department of Commerce. And oftentimes you'll hear our state officials talk about it's not if, but when we will get into offshore wind. What we are very concerned about is making sure that we learn the best practices from places like California that have gone ahead of us to make sure that our coastal communities and fisheries and an extraordinarily important stakeholder for us, the tribal communities, the sovereign nations, are at the table at the outset. We do have the 2 unsolicited bids, and I think that is creating more conversation in our state about how we ought to be approaching this in a way that achieves the high-level goals for us, which are, as I think Jocelyn said so eloquently this morning, the impetus behind this is driven by the same goals that our state made when we said we need to be a clean energy state, and also by the desire to see the economic benefits of this industry come to Washington State. So we're going to make sure we do it the Washington way and have the right community stakeholders at the table at the outset, while at the same time following the science as we do it.
You've got a Washington way. We've got an Oregon way. I wonder if they're about the same thing.
They might be.
We're going to talk a little bit about Oregon, and Molly and I are going to tag team that. I'm from Oregon. I live in Portland, so very active there on offshore wind. In Oregon, we've got some excellent policies, high-level policies driving clean energy development, including our House Bill 2021, which requires ultimately 100% below baseline emissions by 2040. Stepwise 30 at 80%, at 2035 at 90%, and then 100% by 2040. By all accounts, between now and 2030, there's not a lot of demand for new generation. The utilities are in a pretty good posture, but post 2030, it's sort of anybody's guess how they're going to get there. And of course, we have an excellent answer to that in the form of offshore wind. There are a couple of bills that are tracking right now in the Oregon legislature. Senate Bill 678 is a basic policy bill that says it's the policy of the state of Oregon that offshore wind development should bring benefits to the state, unsurprisingly. And House Bill 3069, which establishes an offshore wind task force. I can't speak at this time whether those 2 bills are going to pass, but we've got about a month and a half, I think, left in the state legislature. We've also got a new Democratic governor, Tina Kotek, former Speaker of the House. Her priorities are really focused on health and education. I think it's sort of reality check for Oregon. There's only so many resources to go around to invest in offshore wind. Our state agencies have limited capacity and resources to engage in offshore wind. And the fishing sector is still very concerned and continue to express serious concerns about the potential impacts of offshore wind on their livelihoods. BOEM made excellent progress early identifying call areas. We had 3 call areas, the Coos Bay, the Brookings, and the Gold Beach call area. Gold Beach was removed entirely after a lot of feedback that was a very important fishing ground. Then the Department of Defense identified essentially the bottom 2/3 of the Coos Bay call area as being off limits. And apparently there's highly classified what's happening there. So unlike Diablo Canyon, where they were quick to describe all the activities that were happening there, in Oregon, it's just the case that we're just told that that's just not going to happen. And we are hoping to see, of course, draft wind energy areas. In Oregon, BOEM did add this additional step to the process of having draft wind energy areas, and we're hoping to see those sometime in the near future. So with all that said, Molly, what are your thoughts about Oregon, given those conditions, and what do you see as the best potential areas of collaboration between the states?
Yeah, thanks, Jason. And you've been working on offshore wind in Oregon for many years, so appreciate your laying the land. And I think what you described is Oregon's making progress, but it's not there yet. So first area of collaboration, I'd say, is in advocacy to promote state leadership on offshore wind. And by that, I mean not industry advocacy alone, but ENGO, environmental justice, labor advocacy. And I think about the role that the Offshore Wind Now Coalition has had in California, the multiple ENGOs, environmental justice, labor, that have been working really hard in this state to promote a large-scale, community-benefiting vision of offshore wind. And that's really needed in Oregon. State leadership isn't hearing those sorts of messages in the same way that they're hearing from those that are concerned about the impacts of offshore wind. So I really hope that that can be exported and transferred, either from peer organizations, teaching and sort of encouraging groups there to convince environmentally minded organizations in Oregon about the role of offshore wind in achieving the clean energy goals of the state. So that's area number one. Number two, which is really my top priority, would be on transmission. And we heard, you all were just listening to the last panel. The grids in Southern Oregon and Northern California are weakly developed, especially when you're talking about flows from the coast eastward to the major transmission lines. The north-south major transmission flows are highly congested, but also really important to reliability in the region. So a collaborative transmission solution where you can inject offshore wind from Oregon coast, from Northern California coast, and increase the capacity north-south, north to load centers in Oregon, south to load centers in California, would be sort of a dream, I think. Obviously, regional transmission planning and approval is really hard. That's why FERC has a whole rulemaking about it, and kind of the smartest, hardest working people in energy are trying to crack that nut. We also have the challenge of California being a little bit ahead. So if California is preparing to propose a transmission solution in its transmission plan coming out at the end of 2024 for the North Coast, I think the hope would be that's a solution which could be built on incrementally, or that benefits Oregon's system because it's increasing transfer capacity with California overall, and then offshore wind could later plug in. So transmission's number two. And then third, regional markets. Would sort of be remiss not to mention that topic, since it's a very hot topic in the West right now. I'm sure many are following. We have expanded day-ahead market offerings from both the ISO and SPP from the East, and then very much revived conversations about the possible future of a regional RTO with the CAISO involved in it. So what does that mean for offshore wind? For me, there's a few things. One, we know that regional markets create savings, and if we are producing savings, we have more funds to invest in innovation to deal with the very hard to solve last 15% of decarbonization. So that's one. Regional markets also mean a potential expanded customer base. So we could see California offshore wind selling to Oregon LSEs or C&I customers in Oregon with a single transmission access charge. But even short of a full RTO vision, I could see a scenario where if we have a shared market and we stay together with Oregon, and it's, say, a hot summer day, hydro is very poor that year, California weather is okay, offshore wind is generating, we could have California sort of saving Oregon from an energy crisis in the way that Pacific Northwest Hydro has been saving California the last few times around. And of course, regional markets also kind of tie back into regional transmission planning. So those would be my three and my kind of pitch for why regional markets matter to offshore wind.
Thank you. I would be remiss if we didn't mention House Bill 3375, which actually passed a couple of years ago, which said for Oregon a 3 gigawatt planning goal. It is not a mandate, it's a planning goal. And the Oregon Department of Energy drafted a report on offshore wind. Even though it's clearly not a mandate, it's talked about as if it is now. And when we think about how much wind we want to develop initially, 3 gigawatts becomes the default number. And also happens to coincide fairly closely with the amount of grid capacity that we have in Southern Oregon. I want to switch gears a little bit. Commissioner Calkins and Greg, both of you have been heavily involved in the blue economy. The states of California and Washington clearly recognizing the opportunities in that sector. So talk to us a little bit about that. What is it? Why does it matter? And is offshore wind part of the blue economy?
Start off, Greg.
Sure. So for those who have not heard the term, blue economy would be representative of the total economic value of the ocean, and in particular the sustainable ocean industries like offshore wind, like aquaculture, underwater data mapping, so on and so forth. And it's really developed quite broadly here in California over the last decade, and I think there's a lot of people in this room that have helped that. And we've worked very closely with the state of Washington, specifically with the Port of Seattle, in a prior job that I had with the Maritime Alliance based in San Diego, which is a blue tech cluster organization. But I think for the offshore wind industry, I think one of the opportunities is to talk about the offshore wind industry it's all about ocean optimism. It's about storytelling. It's about engaging the community, engaging residents, engaging the public for a really powerful paradigm shift in the decarbonization of our economy. So blue economy writ large is literally the ocean economy, but it's all about telling a broader story of decarbonization, responsible, ethical use of the ocean environment, ocean resources that create economic development and create jobs.
And I would add to that, I think part of what we want to do as we establish the West Coast as the new energy hub for the United States is we want to recognize that the ancillary aspects of that also need to be green if we really want to be green. And so, I think of the example of Crowley, who I know is here today. They are working on vessels that will do the work of offshore wind, but that will be lower emission or even zero emission vessels to do that work, so that we're not having to run on, our tugboats running on marine gas oil to then go service an offshore wind turbine, or, all of the towing that's going to have to happen to move these things into place or back for service. We'd love for those things to be as low impactful as possible. So, from a blue economy standpoint, we in the Puget Sound, we take great pride in our maritime industry. I think in the state of Washington, we're the most trade-dependent state in the nation, and that's because of our ports. But we're also heavily dependent on maritime for jobs. And so we see an opportunity here in the expansion of the global economy on the ocean is good news for the West Coast of the United States. And so entities like Greg was talking about we have a group called Washington Maritime Blue, which Greg helped to some of the original ideation around it. The Port of Seattle was a funder, the Washington State Department of Commerce. And now it's a freestanding entity that's helping with joint innovation projects around a variety of industries. It's helping us with questions around our marine mammal conservation, like our Quiet Sound program that helps the southern resident killer whales in the Puget Sound, managing vessel traffic. But also now we are examining the possibility of using that same entity as a mechanism for advancing responsible offshore wind development in Washington State. So we think the blue economy is key to the future economic development of Washington State in a post-fossil fuel economy. And so we're quite bullish on that. And we think it'll mean that in the years to come, there will be more maritime jobs in Seattle, not fewer.
And Jason, I'll add one more thing to that too, which Commissioner Calkins kind of triggered in my head, which is from the workforce development perspective. This was part of the discussion at a previous panel. How do we time the workforce development needs of the offshore wind industry based on where the industry is? When you're thinking holistically and thinking about workforce development in the blue economy, there's a lot of crossover in terms of the skill sets that are required. So whether you're making vessels, you're doing underwater data mapping, there's a core set of skills that are really important, that are transferable between some of these other blue economy industries. So I think from a kind of a public and a workforce development perspective, there are a lot of co-benefits, a lot of dual use opportunities.
That's a great extra segue, Greg, into the next question. You've been active in the blue economy and early voice, working both nationally and internationally. So what are the lessons you've learned from organizing the blue economy and the economic development concept of clusters and how that might apply to offshore wind?
Yeah, so I mentioned earlier a cluster in San Diego that coordinates very closely with Washington Maritime Blue in San Diego called the Maritime Alliance, or TMA Blue Tech. So I had the honor to formally be executive director of that organization. And we recognize that, when we're talking about the blue economy, there's a lot of education that's required, but once people get it, they get it. So we brought together, and we were kind of the marshaling organization for San Diego, in terms of bringing together academia, industry, government, to coordinate activities, to coordinate resources. A lot of that cooperative extra industry enterprise that's required to move things along. And that played a pivotal role, I think, in developing this cluster concept in San Diego, where our shipyards, our academic institutions like Scripps Oceanography, the 1,400 plus companies in San Diego's blue tech sector, started working together to solve some of these challenges that I think offshore wind is now also, grappling with and trying to figure out. So I think there's a model in the cluster economic development that, if you follow Michael Porter and his work out of Harvard, you'd be familiar. But certainly San Diego has done a great job. Washington State's done a fantastic job. The New England, you've got the Sea Ahead organization. And in terms of lessons learned, it's, start the communication early, do it often, create formal dialogues, create opportunities for small, medium-sized businesses to interact with each other, to find new business opportunities. So to do that, we developed a Blue Tech Incubator program that helped entrepreneurs find investors, find opportunities internationally through a grant program that the Department of Commerce had in partnership with NOAA and other federal agencies as well. But we also developed the Blue Tech Cluster Alliance. And so it wasn't just San Diego, it wasn't just Washington, it was Canada, Ireland, Portugal, Spain, the UK. And we were connecting those dots, right? Because it's all integrated. So lessons learned was, we can talk about California, we can talk regionally about the West Coast, but we really need to be thinking holistically, internationally. It creates that fabric that an industry, the cluster creates that fabric that the industry really needs to thrive, to be resilient. Because if let's say the Port of San Diego follows through on some sort of a commitment, not saying that they would, there's another entity or another organization in the Puget Sound region that can pick up the pieces. So it's about creating resilience in the industry, creating those network effects that help drive that industry forward, and I think it's worked pretty well.
Well, we have a question from the audience, and it looks suspiciously like the question that we were planning to answer. It's almost as if somebody teed it up for us. Molly, so what examples do you have of regional solutions from the East Coast or other sectors that we could draw from?
Yeah, sure. So I mentioned there's been a mix of competition and collaboration on the East Coast, and there hasn't been really sort of a single entity or even a couple that have kind of comprehensively led collaborative efforts, more sort of an organization finding an area and drawing others in around them. But a few good examples, there's the Regional Offshore Wind Science Collaborative on the East Coast, which is developing research plans and then using those plans to help sort of funnel major research dollars on offshore wind environmental interactions in the smartest way. And that's a model that's already been picked up in AB 80, which I think we've heard about at this conference in the California legislature today. There's the now RDC Research and Development Consortium, which is funded by state and federal dollars and trying to sort of maximize the benefit of research and development across both coasts. There's the Special Initiative of Offshore Wind and Consensus Building Institute are trying to develop a framework for fisheries compensation that covers the Northeast and addresses, how do we assess economic impacts to members of the fishing industry in a way that's fair? How do we distribute those funds in a way that's fair and data-driven? Especially important when you have fisheries that cross borders and fishing industry representatives across borders. There's also an MOU of the Mid-Atlantic states known as Smart Power, with the intention to collaborate on development of regional assets, supply chain, science, regulatory activity. So those are some good examples. And then the other, not from the East Coast, but from another sector that I would like to point to is the DOE's Hydrogen Hub initiative, which put out, a billions of dollar opportunity with explicit incentive for states to collaborate and figure out, hydrogen is a whole supply chain from production through infrastructure down to consumption. How do we put that together across states and who's doing which piece of it? And states really rose to that opportunity. There's, submissions from the Northeast and Intermountain states and Midwest states. So I'd love to see that kind of carrot for how do we develop multi-port, and full supply chain strategies.
I just have to comment on the hydrogen piece. There's $8 billion.
Billions.
For 8 billion with a B. Around hydrogen hubs, and Washington obviously has leaned in heavily on this. It's good to see what can be done in terms of coordinating a response to an opportunity like hydrogen. We've not seen, I think California is a good example for offshore wind. It's very similar. Oregon and Washington to date around offshore wind, it simply has not occurred. But I think once they recognize the opportunity and make the decision, have the political will, we'll see that kind of coordination. And I think it's essential to make the most of the opportunities.
Well, and to that point, I have a front row seat for the whole conversation around the hydrogen hub. In fact, the Port of Seattle has been a supportive partner in that because of our belief that hydrogen will be one of the sort of vessels that allows us to transfer some of all this renewable energy that we need. But a quick reminder that hydrogen is not per se renewable. It is whatever goes into creating the hydrogen that dictates whether it's green or blue or brown or whatever. And so when I think about this hydrogen hub in the Pacific Northwest, if we win that, the next question will be how do we produce the energy we need and it's a very energy intensive problem that we're going to create for ourselves. And so I think it will create a new onus for Oregon and Washington to take more seriously the need to bring more electrons onto the grid from renewable sources. And when you look at it from that perspective, let's say it's 5 or 7 or 10 gigawatts of potential resource in Washington are virtually impossible to ignore. You've got to take them seriously. And so, I think from that perspective, again, these opportunities for collaboration are going to become more and more essential.
I see we have another question. Molly, this might go back to you. That you can read as well as I am. What is the opportunity for regional collaboration for science and environmental monitoring and mitigation? I think of the technical working groups in New York around environmental effects. Are you familiar with those and how they're set up? Are those government run? Are they industry led?
Yeah, so the New York working groups are government run. It's NYSERDA and then the Department of State. And it's regional, but pretty New York centric. So New York in the middle with New York stakeholders and then bringing in others from the region. I think the Regional Science Collaborative on the East Coast is probably a better model to point to because it is looking regionally. And we have the initiative started with AB 80. And I think the authors and sponsors of that bill, there's a reason why they called that the West Coast Offshore Wind Science Collaborative, not the California, because of course it's the California current. It's the whole of our piece of the Pacific. So I think there's huge opportunities for collaboration on environmental science. We're going to be kind of in the same regions as far as distance out from the coast. Obviously, there will be unique habitats, unique ecosystem considerations, but I think there has to be a lot of sort of shared learning that can be done if that research is coordinated.
Perhaps a role for the federal government?
There could be, yeah. I mean, I think state-federal partnerships along with NGOs and industry with seats at the table, guiding, creating sort of a master science plan and figuring out, what research are we starting now? What are we doing for long-term monitoring? Where does adaptive management come in? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So we've seen a couple studies just recently around transmission and port infrastructure that point to this need for regional collaboration, regional solutions. Commissioner, will you maybe talk to us a little bit about ports and what you're seeing with the studies that are focused on the needs of port infrastructure and the current availability along the West Coast?
Yeah, I think there's a perception that the West Coast ports are full. And I would say that while generally we may convey that publicly, we keep our real estate portfolios quite secretive in the interest of being competitive when needing to go out and win tenants for these places. But I think what you're seeing right now is, for the first time in a couple of generations, West Coast ports are really having to think about where demand is going to come from for their facilities. So, and I don't want to go too far down this rabbit hole, but, for most of us big West Coast ports, container cargo has been our principal source of revenue for as long as anyone working at the ports can remember. And it has been a steady upward trajectory in the annual numbers coming across our ports, both directions, really. And a whole variety of factors are now, for the first time, indicating that maybe that's not going to happen in perpetuity, that maybe the West Coast ports are at a level of peak container, let's call it. And so it's really changing the mindset of port planners like me to think about, if not container cargo as our growth strategy, what would it be? And, I think I was very impressed with the Port of Long Beach and coming out with such an ambitious strategy for offshore wind. And I think it shows just how tuned in they are to the geopolitics around West Coast ports. And so while, yes, it may seem as if we are full now, I think most astute port planners are thinking about, what will diversification of my business lines mean? And so I think there's an opportunity for an industry like this. It's certainly what's motivated me from a business standpoint to say, what comes after containerization? As that industry is consolidated and we start to look at what's next, the good news is most of those facilities can be readily, with quite a bit of expense, but they can be turned over into other types of project cargo, like renewable energy cargo. And so I think it's for the most part, a good news story for this area. But again, none of us can do it on our own. We really do need to think of it as a network of port strategy. And that's an area where I'm really appreciative of our federal partners who are continuing to work to kind of herd us cats in the same direction, to say there are great efficiencies that will come if you all work together on this. And also to remember that, over time, the sort of center of gravity of where installations will shift. And it's better to build a system-wide approach from the outset so that we can, Washington and its advanced manufacturing associated with aerospace can contribute in potentially component fabrication that can be shipped by barge to assembly and staging and integration facilities in California, much closer to the early sites. And eventually, California will be able to support on staging and integration for the Washington and Oregon installations. So, I think there's an awareness. I heard a panelist today talk about, I think it was Larry from the Port of Humboldt, talking about Kappa. And what I would say is, let's do a Kappa Plus meeting on occasion. I don't want to interrupt all your meetings, but maybe once a quarter, all of the coastal ports get together and say, how do Oregon and Washington ports support the plans that you have for California? Where is the necessary overflow so that you can stay on your deadlines without us trying to come in and steal your business, but instead say, how do we integrate the system in a way that is ideal for accelerating this industry as quickly as possible?
Yes, I was going to add to that, and Commissioner, I'm so glad you said that. I was going to ask that question. Is there an opportunity for Kappa to expand the discussion to include ports along the West Coast? And it's, I would reposition it. Instead of stealing activity, it's a little bit more of a blue ocean opportunity from a strategic planning perspective. Where are the opportunities to expand business that add total economic value, grow the pie, right? Because your region has tremendous assets that are useful. Obviously Long Beach and Humboldt, San Diego's got some of the largest shipyards in the world as well, or in North America as well. NASCO is already developing a partnership with a Spanish firm on the procurement of ships. that can service the offshore wind industry, and that was announced a couple months ago. It's about where are you finding the opportunities, what is the asset map that exists, and expanding that overall pie. So I would, just underline totally what you just said, and your leadership is amazing.
Molly, I think I know the answer to this already, but what area do you think is most ripe for regional collaboration?
I'd probably go to my answer about Oregon on transmission and advocacy.
Right. So in the final moments here, sort of open-ended question to all of you. I'll start with you, Molly. What would you like to see happen over the next year with regard to regional collaboration around offshore wind?
Yeah, a year is a short amount of time, but I think I'd like to see California really start to prove out its leadership style as an example, and then have Oregon and Washington step up with their own offshore wind targets and lift it from 3 gigawatts to a real true ambitious but achievable goal. And then from there, then we can start, what is the shared vision? What does each state want to put into and get out of that shared vision? That'd probably be the sort of best next step for me.
Commissioner?
I'd love to see let's call it a gubernatorial reset. We've got, obviously, you mentioned Governor Kotek in Oregon. Governor Inslee has just announced that he's not going to run for a 4th term. So he's got about 18 months left, which could be seen as a real opening. You get as a lame duck to do a lot of stuff that maybe you would be afraid to do if you're facing re-election. And then, of course, with Governor Newsom in California being very proactive in this space, I think it would be great to get them just to if we could get them to talk for half an hour about this and say, better together. Let's really focus on this together. And we're certainly committed in Washington to work with our governor to kind of expand that West Coast collaboration.
Agreed 100%. If you have any good, bright ideas on how to make that happen, let's talk. Greg, final comments?
Jocelyn mentioned earlier the NOF from DOE for $4.75 million for a center of excellence. I think it would be awesome to see that be a West Coast center of excellence with, a couple states represented. So that, to me, that sounds like an immediate next step. And we all heard Director Klein mentioned, don't sit on conflict. And then yesterday we heard Mike Conroy on behalf of the fisheries group say, hey, there's a conflict here. They're seeing cumulative impacts on the West Coast. So I would like to see that be addressed as an early next step, because that could be a really important, consideration.
So as part of this panel, what we decided to do was to try to further the conversation around regional collaboration, and maybe next year we can talk about what we've accomplished rather than what we might do in the future. So in order to come up with something that would move the conversation forward, if this is going to work well here, we've pulled together a survey. It's a pretty straightforward, simple survey. It'll be hosted on the POET website. It'll be anonymous, and all the data will be publicly available. And there is the QR code. Appreciate it if you take that survey and describe to us your thoughts on regional collaboration. Do we need it? If so, what does it look like? Where do we need to target our efforts, our limited resources and energy? We'll keep that open for a couple of weeks. You can also access this just by going to the POET website. There'll be a link at the very top. And again, this will be anonymized. The data will be made available publicly, and if you want the raw data, we can provide that to you as well. But appreciate you taking that survey and helping us further this dialogue around regional collaboration. And with that, I ask you to put your hands together in appreciation of the panelists today. And thank you so much for participating in the conference. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as we have.